To properly light our scene, I will need two lights. And to add them to my scene, I will begin by creating a new property in GameView controller. I will add it right below the camera node as a variable called light node, and it will be initialized as an empty SCN node. We will use this node as the parent for all the light nodes we'll need, so that we have one node containing all of our lights. To add the lights, I will create a custom method right below setup camera, and I will call it setup light. Just like we did with all of our other setup methods, I will call it from the viewDidLoad method right at the bottom. Inside of the setup light method, I will create two new light nodes. One ambient light for evenly distributed light throughout the entire scene, and one directional light, which will allow us to cast shadows and really emphasize the three-dimensional elements. Let's begin with the ambient light as a constant ambient node, initialized as a scene node, and then, just like we set the camera property for our camera node, we'll set the light property on our ambient node to a scene light instance. I can then set the ambient node.light.type to be .ambient to specify that this light should be ambient. And that's all for the ambient node. I can then create our second light with a constant called directional node, initialized as a new scene node instance. I would then again initialize the light property with a scene light instance, but this time I will set directional node.light.type to .directional. For this directional light, I will now set some more properties, beginning with directional node.light.casts shadows, which I will set to true. This will just make sure that any nodes that this light is shining at are casting shadows. This will be especially important later on when we add our player, vegetation, and vehicles to our game. I will then also set directional node.light.shadow_color, which will define which color these shadows will have. We're going to use a UI color instance for this, and I will choose the initializer with red, green, blue, and alpha. I obviously don't want to use some kind of bright color for this, but a shade of gray. By default, the shadows would be black, which sometimes seems a little unnatural, so I'll choose 0.4 for red, green, and blue. If I pick the same value for all of them, it will always be a color between black and white, 0.4 being just slightly darker than the middle of the scale. For the alpha value, I will just say 1 for full opacity, which should give us a dark gray shadow. I will now also have to specify the position and orientation of our directional light. I'll begin with the position, which I'll set to a scene vector 3 with x, y, and z values. For the x value, I will say -5 to move it a little to the left of our center, which will cast our shadows right along our lanes. Y will be 5, so that our light is a little above our scene. And for the z value, I'll say 0 to stay centered. I would then set directional node.EulerAngles to another scene vector 3 instance where I do not want to rotate along the x-axis, so I'll say 0, and on the y-axis I want to rotate by exactly -90 degrees, which will make sure our directional light shines right along our lanes. I can use my 2radians function by writing -2radians and passing 90 for the angle. Now all that's missing is our rotation along the z-axis, where I want to rotate by -45 degrees to point our light towards the ground. So let's add -2radians with the angle 45. I have now completed my ambient node and my directional node. And I can now add them both to my main light node, which I can then add to the scene. So let's write light node dot add child node, ambient node, and light node dot add child node, directional node. Finally, I want to position this light node right where my camera is. So let's write light node dot position is equal to camera node dot position. And then scene dot root node dot add child node and light node. This will add all of my lights to the scene, since this node contains the two lights. So let's run the app and see if it looks different. The app started and we can definitely see a difference, especially here where the road lane meets the grass lane. We can really tell that there is a difference in height. That is thanks to our two lights that are now illuminating our scene and emphasizing its three-dimensional characteristics. We now have completed quite a lot of fundamental work for our game by adding a floor, lanes, a camera, and lights. So it's about time that we think about adding actual models to our game, like our player, but also vehicles to drive on our roads, and maybe some trees and hedges that we could position on our grass lanes. And this is what we're going to do next.